Madam Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters and most welcome guests. I think this is the most people I've ever seen in this room, so thank you all for entrusting me with your evening. I hope it's going to be a couple of hours of fun and maybe you'll go away and learn a little bit. Now, the evening is called Lift Your Language, so obviously you'll be expecting me to start off by talking about the English language. So I'm going to start off talking about history. History in general, history in particular, my ancestor, Sir Boris Starling. I'm afraid, yes, that Christian name again. Anyway, Sir Boris Starling had a life passion, and it was about superfoods. Now, he lived during the 16th and the 17th centuries. He was a courtier to Queen Elizabeth I and to King James I. And at that time, he was a very famous man. Boris Starling, hundreds of years before the first Toastmasters Club was launched, was actually travelling the length and breadth of the British Isles, giving lectures on his superfood. Now, what is this superfood, I hear you all ask? Well, it took him decades to find it. Some people would say he was an alchemist. Other people would say he was a social psychologist. He was an observer of human nature. What he was looking for was a superfood which inspired people, excited people, made them feel good about themselves. And when he discovered the recipe, he devoted the rest of his life to it. And it's interesting that this year, 2016, is exactly 400 years since he was executed. Now, Sir Boris Starling, as he travelled the country, developed a huge following of people who put enormous faith in his superfood. And as I look around the room this evening, I know that it has influenced many people here. What is this superfood, I hear you ask? Well, he named it his Vim Vitae, which is the Latin for life force. And he sold it in prodigious quantities around the British Isles. What is this Vim Vitae? What is this life force? Well, to help me answer that question and retaining a family tradition, my daughter Lara is going to be showering you with Vim Vitae at certain stages throughout the evening. Vim Vitae is, of course, chocolate. Now, when I read my Toastmasters manuals, they tell me that when I do a speech, I should use rhetorical devices. They tell me I should always incorporate the word of the day. Well, I have performed the role of grammarian more than once. And I found this very difficult, and I've noticed the difficulties other people have. In fact, the word of the day is often about as popular as a viper in a lucky dip. So, why is this? Why do people have problems using rhetorical devices? I think it's got something to do with how we learn the English language. There is a phase in our lives when we're about 18 months old when we start picking up language. And the way we develop language depends very much on the people around us, our culture, the part of the country we live in. Is English our first language? And as we develop and learn English, we tend to go through life sticking to speech patterns with which we're comfortable. Now, what we're going to do tonight is look at other speech patterns. I'm going to be inviting you to step outside your comfort zones and try new things. So, the evening is divided into 3 parts. The first part, we will be looking at what I will call avoids. They're common mistakes people make in rhetoric. We'll then have a 5-minute break. That will be followed by another section in which we'll be looking at devices which we should actually use in our speeches. And after a lot of thought, I came up with the word employs. So that will be called employs. And the second half of the employ section, there'll be another 5-minute break, is going to be looking at humour. Now, humour is very important in speeches, and we do have the humorous speech contest coming up quite soon. And throughout the course of the evening, this is an interactive evening, I will be asking people to participate. And if you could just raise your hand if you want to answer a question and then stand up, that would be marvellous. So, let's make a start. Before we do, one thing I'd like you to bear in mind when you leave this evening. This isn't about radically changing everything you do. This is about looking at the way you speak in general and just raising your game by a little bit. Just one or two new rhetorical devices in a speech of 5 to 7 minutes will make a tremendous difference to that speech. So the important thing is to experiment and have fun while you're doing it. So the first thing we're going to look at, if you look at your workbooks, are called avoids. Now, I'm a writer, and as a fiction writer, I'm very familiar with a term called the fictive dream. The fictive dream is about fiction. It's about a good story which takes you to a different time and place. Now, in fiction, it's very important to draw someone into that world and then keep them there. You mustn't do anything to disrupt the fictive dream. The same principle applies with speech making. Giving a speech, you're trying to draw people in, you're trying to keep them interested. It's absolutely essential you don't do anything which bursts them out of that sense, that dream sense. A mobile phone going off is an obvious example, but there are others, and it can be the content of your speech which does that. So when we're doing a speech, be very conscious of not breaking the fictive dream. And to help us do that, I like to classify words into 3 categories. Everyday words, the sort of words we use when we're talking to friends and family, should form the bulk of your speech. These words, 9 times out of 10, are appropriate when speech making. They're not very inspiring, and when you're making your speech, you will occasionally come to a point when you want to add emphasis, or it may be at the end of the beginning, or it may be the conclusion of your speech. At that point, consider upgrading your language a little bit and using more inspiring or elegant language. As for the over-the-top language, it can have a place in humour. It can be very funny. But if you're not doing a humorous speech, it's not a good idea to use words which no one will understand, because they'll make you sound show-offy, can even annoy people, and it'll certainly knock you out of the auditory dream, because the listener will go, what does that word mean? Oh, I've forgotten. Oh, and then the speech has moved on and you've missed a point. So bear in mind the need to keep your listeners in the auditory dream. And if this workbook is about one thing, it's about keeping your listener in the auditory dream. So that is the avoids for you. Let's move on to repetition. And shortly I'll be asking people in the room to join in. Now, if we go back to the way we developed our speech patterns, there are certain clauses and phrases and words which we are naturally more comfortable than others, and we tend to use those over and over when making a speech. Now, this is fine, except we can adopt phrases or we can overuse words which to the room may jar, may knock you out of the auditory dream. So a good idea when doing a speech is to film yourself on your phone and watch yourself, or obviously ask a friend to come along and help you with the speech. And if there is something which you're overusing, adjust accordingly. Now, we see there's an exercise here under repetition. There's a little paragraph which contains some repetition. So with a minute on the clock, I'll invite everyone just to read that paragraph and see what they don't like about it, where there is repetition, and then we'll have a look at that. So just spend a minute studying that paragraph. Okay, now would anyone like to volunteer where the repetition occurs in this paragraph? Harminder, thank you.
Right, it's the use of the word I. So like the majority of your sentences here are starting with I. I thought, I was amazed, I imagined, etc.
That's absolutely right. Anything else which has been repeated? Mm? Well, some words we have to repeat. As Harminder pointed out, there are 4 sentences and, well, 3 sentences and 1 clause which begin with the same construct. I thought, I was, I imagined, but I was too scared. And it begins to get a bit jarring on the audience if everything is always delivered the same way. So bear that in mind when you're preparing a speech. If I was rewriting this paragraph, I would change it to something like, Lucy's eyes were amazing. Bottle green with thick, dark lashes you could ski jump off. Her poise and sense of fun captivated me as I dreamed of asking her out, but I was too scared. Now, in that version, I've used 35 words. In the other version, there are 48. So this is roughly a 25% saving in words. So if you're giving a 5 to 7 minute speech and you can rip out 25% of your repetition, you will be able to say a lot more. The speech will travel faster and it will be more engrossing for your audience. So that's repetition. Now, point 3 is cliche. So we've worked our way through the competent communication manual, and we've decided, right, tonight's the night. I'm going to put in some flowery prose into my speech. And you think of something, and you put it into your speech. Now, the problem is, the first phrase that pops into your head is likely to have done so for a reason. Cliché is any phrase or opinion which has been overused to the extent that it loses its impact. It becomes fairly meaningless. It also demonstrates a lack of original thought. So when preparing a speech and you put in one of these phrases, have a look at it. And if you're not sure if it's a cliche or not, there are plenty of websites you can actually use to Google cliches. And it only takes a minute or two to reformulate the words to say the same things in an original way. The problem, of course, with cliche is once you start noticing it, it becomes a bit of a drag. So always slow down, look at the phrasing, the phrases you use, the clauses you use, and ask yourself that question. Now, we have a number of examples. Who would like to be my volunteer to read out the exercises? Second one. So,
all that glitters is not gold.
thank you. Is that a cliche? It is a cliche, yes, of course it's a cliche, thank you. And the second one?
Take the bull by the horns.
Cliche? Correct. Third?
Sell on a full moon.
No, I made that up this morning, so I'm glad you haven't. And the next one?
Fit as a fiddle.
Yeah.
Definitely a cliche, yes.
Avoid it like the plague.
Yeah.
Yep, cliche. And the last one?
A blue sky never weeps.
That isn't a cliche, I made it up this morning, but I do hope one day it will become a cliche. I rather like that one. Anyway, so we won't go through all of these, but if we wanted to change, say, the first one, all that glitters is not gold, and take it away from being a cliche, how would we say that? What phrase would we change that for?
It might look good, but it actually isn't.
Correct. And you can compress that even more into just something like, don't get conned. Most cliches can be broken down to 2 or 3 words. We don't have a huge amount of time, so I won't go through these all this evening. But bear in mind when you're trying to get yourself away from the danger of using cliches, what is actually at the core of the cliche? Use those words instead. It's much more powerful. Have I used any cliches this evening? I used stepping outside your comfort zone right at the beginning. Now, that's a terrible cliche. And a tip this evening is there will be lots of little questions like that, and Lara is dying to start hurling chocolates around, so pay attention. So, cliches. Let's move on to redundancies. Now, redundancies in speech making, it's very important to use the correct number of words. We often overspeak. We often say things with more words than are needed to make the point. The extra words can be removed because the others have already served their purpose. Now, below that, we have a few examples. Who'd like to read out these examples of redundancies? Yeah, thank you, Brian.
Burning fire. Repeat again. Sum total. And blatantly obvious.
Thank you. So all of those are redundancies. Each of those can be cut by one word because they double the meaning. And once again, if you're listening and you're aware of these things, it doesn't reflect very well on the speech maker. So be hyper alert about using redundancies. Now, in the exercise over leaf, he oozed forward, the knife gripped tightly in his hand, a sneer played across the furious features of his angry face. Are there any redundancies in there? Correct. Gripped tightly. The only way you grip something is tightly, so we don't need to grip tightly. Anything else?
Furious features and angry face?
Exactly. Furious features of his angry face. If you're angry, your features are furious, and vice versa. So there's another redundancy. They followed each other, one after the other, in succession. I think that was pretty obvious. It's like a double redundancy. I have heard it, but that's a fairly obvious one. The last human on Earth sat alone in the room. I don't think I need to say any more about that one. Okay, let's move on to limiting adverbs. Limit adverbs, upgrade your verbs. Now, through laziness, we often use a fairly boring verb and stick an adverb in front of it. If we look underneath, maybe someone would like to read out these two examples for me. The first one starts with Mark.
Mark spoke softly with his mouth whispered.
Very good.
Without a parachute, the man fell to earth very quickly. Without a parachute, the man plummeted to earth.
Thank you. So in both those, yes, I think you've earned yourself a chocolate. You can throw them, Lara, but we don't have insurance, so try not to break a window again. So with upgrading your verbs, the general principle is adverbs are laziness. Look for a verb which does more work than a casual verb with an adverb, and those two examples, I think, demonstrate that. So below it, we have the boxer struck the heavy bag ferociously until he was so tired. How could we upgrade that sentence?
Maybe say until he was exhausted.
That's half of it. What about the other half? He struck the bag ferociously. Struck the bag. He pummeled the bag. He could kick it if he was a kickboxer. But again, it's about using as few words as possible. The less words, the more powerful on the whole. Now, Lara, will you give Susanna a chocolate? I think she definitely earned it. Now, to this point in the evening, I'm sure everyone is relieved that I've used almost no long or difficult words. Unfortunately, that has to all change now, because the English language loves to use difficult words whenever it can. And the terms which follow, most of them come from ancient Greek, and they are difficult, they're not familiar words. Don't worry about the specifics of the words themselves. But one thing is, if you leave here and you don't remember anything other than a few of these words, they can be pub quiz gold. So try and memorize a couple. And the first one we're going to look at is the wonderfully named periphrasis. Who would like to read out the definition of periphrasis for me?
Periphrasis is a long-winded way of speaking. It tends to confuse and gives the impression that the speaker is trying to sound too clever.
Thank you. So, saying I am going to is a very common example of periphrasis. All you actually have to say is I will. Ditto, well, the next one is obviously a humorous one, but there is a famous sports article which included this one, in which a rugby ball was described as a mid-sized leather ovoid. What about the third one? The mercury in the thermometer settled 2 degrees above the normal mark. And what do you think about that instead of I have a temperature? And on that note, have a look at the exercise beneath. You can have a minute on the clock to work out how to reduce this to the bare minimum number of words. And I will give you a clue, and the first person who gets this gets a chocolate. This can be reduced to only 4 words. Right, any ideas?
Actually, the homework is lost.
And there's about one too many words there, but that's absolutely right. I lost my homework. I mean, it's quite amusing as it is, but again, periphrasis is being long-winded. It doesn't really add anything to a speech. So when you're composing your speech, you know, be very conscious of the words you're choosing. So those are some of the avoids. If you listen to Barack Obama, who I think is one of the greatest speech makers in the world at the moment, whether or not you agree with his politics, you will notice that he uses very simple words and he speaks very slowly, but he uses extremely powerful rhetorical devices when he wants to make a point, which is what we're going to be looking at in the second section. So we can now have a 5-minute break, and when we come back, I'll ask everyone just to work in pairs. But we'll have a 5-minute break now, and please be as quick as possible. There is water at the back, and there are some biscuits, I think, as well. And we'll start again in 5 minutes. Thank you. Right, welcome back. This is the second of 3 chunks of the evening, and we're going to be keeping Lara really busy from now on. So, this section is the first of the 2 employ sections. Devices which you should try and use in your speeches. And the first one is epiphany. Now, an epiphany is a moment in your life when something dramatic happens and then you change your view on that thing, and for the rest of your life you carry the view with you. Now, epiphany is a very powerful, life-changing event. And if you're looking for a topic for a speech, it's not a bad idea to ask yourself, okay, I'm going to do a speech on this particular topic. Did you form the opinion associated with that topic as a result of an epiphany? If you didn't, well, make one up, no one will know. But otherwise, pick a topic which you did actually have an epiphany for, because it's a very powerful device to draw in your audience and to get them into the auditory dream. Now, epiphany can take many forms. We have some examples here. Who would like to read out my 2 examples?
I was smoking 40 a day. I went to visit Aunt Mary in hospital, and the woman in the next bed didn't stop coughing. Mary whispered that the woman had lung cancer. I never smoked again. The second one, everything changed the day I decided to stop taking myself so seriously.
Thank you. Lara? Now, both of those are powerful epiphanies. And if you're giving a speech, can you see how powerful it would be to actually start your speech with either of those epiphanies? There are many ways you can start a speech. I could have chosen others, but for this evening I'm just looking at epiphany. So let's imagine we're going to do a speech. I'd like everyone in the room to think of an epiphany in their lives and just write down a couple of lines in the box underneath, and then we'll just listen to a few. So have a minute just to think up an epiphany and write it in a few elegant words. Okay, would anyone like to volunteer an epiphany? Robin at the back.
After 5 years of living in London, I suddenly noticed that all the poles on the red line in the tube were red, and all the poles in the blue line, Piccadilly line, were dark blue. And after that, my life was much more stable.
I think that's definitely a suite to the back of the room. Now that presumably is a comic epiphany. I'm not sure where Robin would lead with that, but it got our attention, apart from being amusing. It was interesting. And that's so crucial. Any other offers?
The day I realized Santa Claus didn't exist, I had to like everyone, pretend he did.
Very good, no? Thank you. Try not. Oh! Well, the important thing about an epiphany is when looking for a speech topic, go back through important phases in your life. Look why you hold strong views on certain things. And then if you can match that to an epiphany, you'll be off to a very good start on your next speech. Right. Sentenitia, what a wonderful word. Who'd like to read out the definition of this for me? Thank you.
Sentenitia is the use of a famous modern Latin notation to say simple ones are good.
Thank you. So this is a little bit like using an epiphany to draw attention. Now, we don't want to overuse this, but There are some wonderful quotes out there, and there's no reason why we can't use one of those as a cornerstone of a speech. For example, we all know that Martin Luther King is famous for, "I have a dream." And if you did a speech in which you kept saying, "I have a dream," I think you'd probably annoy people, unless you attributed it to Martin Luther King right at the start. So there's no reason why you can't start a speech by saying, "As Martin Luther King said, I have a dream." You can then do your speech, which will be a different dream from his, I hope. And at the end of the speech, you can incorporate that 3 or 4 more times. You will have really sort of coattailed on the power of his expression. Ditto, he who controls others may be powerful, but he who has mastered himself is mightier still. Perhaps you're doing a speech on self-realization. I don't know. But phrases like this, expressions like this, and quotes are all a very powerful way to underline your message. So when, again, you're doing a speech, go online and Google the main topic, the core topic, and see who has made interesting quotes about that, and then use them in your speech and be sure to attribute the person the speech comes from. We also have by Malala Yousafzai, who's this incredible young lady who is only 19 years old and she already has a Nobel Prize. When the whole world is silent, even one voice becomes powerful. Again, you could use that to tremendous effect in a speech. Lastly, all the forces in the world are not so powerful as an idea whose time has come, which of course we all know is Victor Hugo. So there's an exercise here, which I want you to do in your spare time or on the way home. Just look for powerful quotes which will lift your speech. It's a very simple rhetorical device by which you can really draw people in, because if they're familiar with one of these quotes and they hear it again, it's going to grab their attention. They're going to listen closely to how you use it. The next device is anaphora. Sounds like someone's name, doesn't it? Anyway, it's the repetition of a word or phrase in successive clauses or sentences. Now, if we look at the paragraph below, this is an example of the power of Barack Obama's speech-making. Who would like to read out the first of these examples for me?
This country has more wealth than any nation, but that's not what makes us rich. We have the most powerful military in history, but that's not what makes us strong. Our university, our culture are all the envy of the world, but that's not what keeps the world coming to our shores.
Thank you. And the second one?
My life is my purpose, my life is my goal, my life is my inspiration.
Thank you, Laura. So it's succession of clauses in sentences, and you see the power, especially in the first one. So when you listen to a speech by Barack Obama, break it down, look for why it's a powerful speech, and then there's no reason why, when you're constructing your own speech, you can't use exactly the same literary device. And this is a good example of that. Let's have some fun here. Let's provide an example of anaphora about a baby. Okay, do we have any volunteers? I, of course, have the advantage of having prepared everything in advance. Yes, go ahead.
It's my baby, it's her baby, it's our baby.
Precisely. Very good. And any other example? Yeah, Susanna? No? No? That's a very powerful, simple, direct example of anaphora. The one which I composed, actually I think I stole this off a website anyway. It says, buying nappies for the baby, feeding the baby, playing with the baby. This is what your life is when you have a baby. Very powerful tool. Save them for you.
Can I just ask you something? My life is my purpose, my life is my goal, my life is my inspiration. Isn't that a repetition?
It is a form of repetition, yes. Anaphora is repetition. But for dramatic effect. So it's not repetition of the word as in a tautology. It's like the power of three, if you like, just used in a slightly different way. The next one we come on to is the wonderfully named antimetaboly. Now, antimetabole is a repetition of words in successive clauses, but in a transposed order. I'll read out a couple of these. I know what I like, and I like what I know. It's not even the beginning of the end, but is perhaps the end of the beginning, by Winston Churchill. Everyone, of course, knows what's that referred to. No?
The end of the Second World War.
It was the end of the Battle of Britain. Yeah. Ask not what you can do for ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. Now that was in President Kennedy's inauguration speech, and it was one of those wonderful examples of antimetabole, which has occurred again and again and again, and I keep hearing it. It crops up just because it's such a wonderful use of language. So, going back to what Paul said, repetition is a device which can be used, but it has to be used in a particular way. It has to serve a purpose. And antimetabole is a very good example of it. Now, the exercise finished these examples of antimetabole. So the first one, I don't live to work, but rather I... We do not stop playing because we grow old. We grow old because we stop playing. Laura? When you look into the abyss,
The abyss looks into you.
absolutely. Friedrich Nietzsche, a very scary but interesting expression, that one. So let's have an example of antimetabole from the room. You can have a minute on the clock. Think of something to do with your job, something to do with work, and see if you can come up with an example of antimetabole.
It's not that my clients are crazy, it's that I'm crazy about my clients.
Very good. Laura, this man needs a chocolate. Anything else?
It's not the years in your life that count, it's the life of the years.
Yes. Any other examples?
It's not that my boss hates me, it's I hate
I hate my boss. Yes, very good. That's excellent. Now, the next one we come on to is the wonderfully named Zeugma. Now, never let it be said that an evening with Ben Starling is a wasted evening. I mean, a number of women have said that, but we won't say it this evening. Because imagine you leave tonight and you don't remember a thing you learned and you lose this on the tube, or you never open it again and never read it. Next time you're buying a puppy or a kitten or a hamster, what a wonderful name, Zeugma. I think I'm going to get a dog just to call it Zeugma. Anyway, Zeugma occurs when a word, usually a verb, applies to more than one noun, blending grammatically and logically different ideas. So when you're looking to create your own Zeugma, begin by identifying words that have more than one meaning but sound the same, homonyms, and then work on from there. So we have some examples. Who would like to read out the examples? Thank you.
Simon lost his watch and his temper. He noticed the situation and the power. You are free to execute your in-laws and your citizens. Your meal and the company were delicious.
Thank you. And Laura? And you'll notice that the first ones were all verb. We're all verb-based, but you can also have adjective-based Zeugmas. So the meal and the company were delicious. I think I've actually used that myself when feeling lazy about thanking someone for dinner. You know, you just dash it off. But the exercise we're going to do here is to create your own Zeugma about school children. So we'll have a minute on the clock and just see what everyone can come up with. Okay. Any suggestions?
I was driving the car and the children were driving me crazy.
Excellent.
I supported the school and the children.
Yes, absolutely. And the one I wrote down was, in 2015, Johnny grew 2 inches, Mary Jo grew 1 inch, and their teacher grew bored. So again, it can be humorous. But it's a very effective rhetorical device. Which moves us on to isocolon. Now, isocolon involves a succession of sentences, phrases and clauses of grammatically equal length or similar structure. Examples. The old Harley-Davidson slogan, American by birth, rebel by choice. Or, some days you get the elevator, some days you get the shaft. And what it says, I think, on my website, author, artist, boxer, dreamer, fool. So, isocolon, again, through succession of grammatically equal length, is a very powerful tool. Let's have a look at the exercise. Complete these examples of isocolon. The bigger they are,
the harder they fall.
Correct. I came, I saw.
I conquered.
Who said that?
Julius Caesar.
Well done. Finders, keepers, losers. Melts in the mouth, not in. Who said that?
M&S.
M&Ms. Juxtaposition. Juxtaposition is a technique in which two or more ideas are placed side by side to develop comparisons and contrast. So I need a volunteer to read these out. Who'd like to read these out? Thank you, Brian.
Frank's home was a tiny cottage at the top of the hill. Leo's was a vast castle at the bottom. All's fair in love and war. The waiter rushed the first course. He took his time serving dessert. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epic of belief. It was the epic of incredible, whatever it is. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us.
Thank you, Brian.
And if I was writing a speech, I wouldn't put them difficult words in.
You should have checked before you you volunteered, but thank you anyway. But juxtaposition, again, is a powerful tool because we go with this idea, we go with that idea. It's the contrast which matters here. And some of the literary greats have used juxtaposition a great deal. I think this Charles Dickens quote from A Tale of Two Cities, I think it's how the book actually opens. So the exercise is, provide an example of juxtaposition about parties. Maybe the last party you went to. You have a minute on the clock. Okay, any examples of juxtaposition?
We were the first to arrive, but the last to leave.
Exactly. That's the one which I had here as well. Any other ideas?
Everyone served a great time.
Yes, that's fine. Any other offerings?
The Conservative Party lost, the Labour Party lost, the non-voters won.
Okay. Although that's 2 and a 1, maybe it would be better balance with 1 and a 1 or a 2 and a 2, but it's still juxtaposition. Thank you. Any other examples? Let's see if we can squeeze one more out of the room. Yeah.
She was the life of the party in the death.
Oh, very nice. I like that. Is that original to you? Too sweet, sorry. Any others? Okay, that does juxtaposition. Now, hooks. As an author, hooks are incredibly important because they want to not only keep you in the fictive or auditory dream, but they want you to know what's going to happen next. And there's no reason why this technique can't be used in speech making. There are lots of ways of using hooks, and there are some examples I've given here. And when you're preparing your next speech, ask yourself the question, how interesting is this, in fact? I mean, we come up on stage, a sea of friendly faces before us, very kind faces. What happens if you're giving a speech to a more hostile room? Maybe it's a wedding reception where people don't know you. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bring that up. But maybe it's at work. There are times when you can use hooks to really catch the attention of your audience. If you remember books like, what was that extraordinary book about an albino monk running around in circles after a holy something? And although I really hated reading it, I had to keep going because I wanted to know what happened next. So whenever you are hooked by a book, look at the device, the way it's been constructed, and ask yourself, can I use that in a speech? If you look at these examples, there are 5 different ways you can hook a speech. There are more, but these are the most suitable ones for speech making. So you can pose a question in your audience's mind. Now imagine if you started your speech with, if I'd known then what I know now. That's much more powerful than just standing up and saying, it was raining and I set off for work and I was late. And If you can start a speech with a hook, you will really capture your audience's attention. And it's not just once that you need to use a hook. If you break a speech into the traditional beginning, middle, and end, you could open with a hook. You could come back to that hook at the end of the first section or in the second section, and everyone's expecting you to reveal the answer. But you don't have to. You can add to it. You can add another layer of mystery. And that will have the entire room champing at the bit, cliché alert, waiting to know what happens next. And when you get to the end of the speech, you can then reveal it. And your audience will be far more interested in your speech if you do it that way. You could begin your speech with a pivotal moment. As I kissed her cheek, I knew I'd never see her again. That poses a question in my mind. Why will I never see her again? Or why will the speech maker never see me again? You want to know more. It's interesting. Ditto, create an interesting picture. The hills rolled unbroken to an ocean so blue I cried. The picture itself is appealing, but why did the speech maker cry? You want to know more. Has he spent 20 years in prison and he's just come out? Or has he spent his entire life working so that he can afford to buy a cottage by the sea? We don't know, but we want to know. So consider using hooks, certainly at the beginning of your speech, and keep running them throughout. You can start with an unusual situation. Tom moaned as he pressed the forged money into my hand. Why did he moan when he pressed the money, and why was it forged? Poses questions which we want to have answered. So when you're constructing your speech, instead of just giving the information out, why not use hooks to make it more interesting and drag your audience along? Finally, you can start with a compelling dialogue. I really shouldn't be telling you this, but everyone wants to know what you're then going to tell them. Consider starting a speech like that. So, let's have some examples here. Who would like to read out the example which I have here at the end of the opening section? Any volunteers? There's a chocolate in it. Thank you.
At the end of the opening section of the speech about a missing person, Inspector Davies had only one lead, a mysterious tear in Ralph's jacket. Why was it Z-shaped? Was it a case of kidnapping or murder? At the end of the middle section, yes, the inspector did finally solve the puzzle of the torn jacket. The scratch button held the key. Finally, reveal all in your conclusion.
Thank you very much. So here we have a dramatic event which is running through the speech, and we keep it going. And instead of revealing what the Z tear was all about, we actually build on the initial hook by adding another layer of intrigue. And there's no reason why we can't do that when we're speech making. So your exercise here is a very simple one. You can go home and you can read up on some of these amazing authors. Some of these and when you come back to come to writing your next speech, try and incorporate some hooks. The interesting thing is, the facts in your dialogue may be exactly the same, however you deliver your speech, the actual underlying information, but the devices you use to present your speech are all the difference between whether your audience is going to be wrapped up in the speech or whether it's going to be sleeping. So this is another example of a powerful tool. Okay, the next one, litotes. Litotes is an understatement that uses a negative to express a positive. In other words, a statement is made about what is by saying what is not. Now, they are actually easy to use once you understand how they're constructed, so there's no reason why we can't incorporate them in speeches. There are some examples here. Who would like to read out the examples? Thank you.
She's not as young as she once was. If you're in search of a boring evening, don't go to Toastmasters. You won't regret it. I will multiply them, and they shall not be few. I will make them honored, and they shall not be small. I can't get no satisfaction.
Thank you. I personally wonder whether the one by the Rolling Stones was a deliberate example of litotes. I think they may have just been using a double negative incorrectly, but I may be wrong. But anyway, the exercise is provide an original example of litotes, let's say about food. Who would like, well, we'll have a minute on the clock and then we'll see what everyone comes up with.
Pizza, how delicious. I can't stop eating it.
Okay. So they're quite easy to construct. The ones I put down, one is very relevant to this evening. The first one is, there isn't anything I wouldn't eat if I was hungry. Second one is, I can't not eat chocolate. So, that's litotes. The next device we're going to look at is clause reversal. Now, if you remember at the beginning of the evening, I described how when we learn language, we move on and we tend to get stuck in our own ways and we don't go to huge efforts to ever change anything. So we tend to use the same clause constructions, the same sentence constructions. We probably have favorite words, favorite adverbs, favorite verbs, favorite adjectives. Now, you can change the way you speak, and when delivering a speech, of course, on the whole, you want to deliver your speech in very clear, simple, straight language. But when you come to a point in the speech when you want to emphasize something, when you want to make a point or your audience to change gear as they listen to your speech, it's a very effective tool to reverse your clause construction. Now, sentences are made up of two types of clause. An independent clause is a series of words which make sense on their own. It's a subject and a verb. It's actually called a verb predicate. Be that as it may, but I sat down in the chair makes sense on its own, and that is an independent clause. If I then added to that clause, to that sentence, because I was tired of standing, that doesn't make sense on its own, so that is a dependent clause. That only makes sense because it's dependent on the other part. So the sentence we would have there is, I sat down in the chair because I was tired of standing. That's the normal way we speak, and it's fine. But if we wanted to actually lift our speech and get people listening and paying more attention, we can reverse the order of these clauses. If we look at the examples below, we have the dependent clauses are in italics and the independent clauses come at the end. You would expect these sentences to be delivered the other way around. May I have a volunteer to read out these three examples? Thank you, Kasia.
One December morning, near the end of the year, when snow was falling moist and heavy for miles all around, so that the earth and the sky were indivisible, Mrs. Bridge emerged from her home and spread her umbrella. After Sarah wowed the audience with her singing, she was awarded first prize. Because Mother said so, everything is going to be all right.
Thank you. Laura? Now, the interesting thing about clause reversal is it's a little bit unexpected. Especially I found with the first one, there's quite a lot of information coming my way, and I don't know where it's leading, so I'm interested. If that sentence was delivered with Mrs. Bridge emerged from her home and spread her umbrella, well, that's all great. It's not terribly interesting. And then the detail is added afterwards. I don't really need the detail, but if you put the detail first, it generates a level of intrigue. I want to know what happens next. So periodically, throughout your speech, why not turn the clauses around the order of the clauses? It makes for much more interesting listening. Exercise. Reverse the clauses in the following sentence. This is very simple. Who'd like to read out the reversal of this sentence?
An ancient willow had sprung from the bank. The lovers ate their lunch.
Very close. Beneath an ancient willow that had sprung from the bank. So I'm saying to myself, yes, what happened? The lovers ate their lunch. Contains more intrigue. Would you say chocolate? Thank you. Laura, so let's have a minute on the clock and provide an example of clause reversal about a school memory. I'm sure we can come up with a few. Paul?
I used to go to school on the train. On the train, I used to go to school. Not fantastic, is it?
It's very vivid. I got the point. Any others? Yes.
I was talking about them. My audience was interested.
Very good. The one I have down here is, because I wrote the best essay, the teacher congratulated me in front of the whole class. It's just it's variation, and I think, speech making with variety is interesting speech making. Now we have time to get in one more before the next break, and this is a syndeton. And it's terribly simple. A syndeton is the omission of a conjunction in a sentence, usually in a list of things. So I'll read these out. I remember those evenings at Grandma's, full of laughter, conversation, learning, garlic. Normally you'd have and garlic, but we've removed the conjunction there. Consciousness of place came ebbing back to him slowly over a vast tract of time, unlit, unfelt, unlived. James Joyce. So for the last chocolate before the break, who would like to remove the conjunction in this last exercise? This now reads, at the end of the day, the insurance won't cover the car, the luggage, the missed flight. Okay, we're going to have another break now, 10 minutes, and then when we come back, we'll be looking at the humorous section of the evening. So have a 10-minute break, and I'll see you back at just after past. Okay, so for the last third of the evening, we're going to look at humour. Now, we've got a humorous speech contest coming up very soon, so it's always useful to brush up on some humorous techniques. The other reason for looking at humour is there aren't many speeches that don't benefit from it. Now, you've all been paying excellent attention this evening. The last phrase was a version of what? When I said there aren't many speeches that don't benefit from it, what was that? Expressing a positive with a negative. Litotes. Laura? Thank you. Now, when talking about humour, I can obviously only scratch the surface of this topic. That was a... Yes, that was a cliche. Now, what we're doing here is when you begin to recognise the mistakes, for want of a better word, and the devices I'm using as I speak, you'll find it easier when you're composing your own speeches, when to use things, when not to use things, when to take things out, when to modify them. So whenever you listen to someone's speech, it's a very good idea to dissect it, to break it down, to work out what they're doing. You'll then find it easier to spot those mistakes when you make them yourself. So, moving on to humour. There are many, many ways of being funny. I'm told. I haven't yet discovered any of them. But there are entire courses you can go on which run for days and weeks on how to be funny. And some of the great comedians spent their entire lives perfecting the art. Humour can be looked at as a sort of scale. And at every level of that scale, it can be very funny. At the bottom of the scale, there are techniques like double entendre, slapstick, taboo. We're familiar with all of these. We see them on television all the time. What I'm going to look at tonight is a different level. It's more subtle. It's really building on where we've been already this evening. And I'm going to start with what is quite a familiar term, which is irony. Now, irony is a common and powerful humorous device. It's defined as the expression of meaning by using language that signifies the opposite. Now, before we go into that in detail, there's something I just want to say about humour. There is a principle called reversal of expectation. Now, reversal of expectation can apply to humour. It can apply actually to any form of narrative. It's when you take your audience or your reader and you lead them down a path in a certain direction, and everything about that journey down the path makes the person think they're going in a certain direction to a certain destination. If, when they get to the very end of the path, you ambush them with the unexpected, that is a reversal of expectation, and it's an extremely powerful tool. Humour relies heavily on reversal of expectation. And as we go through these various examples, I will point out, and I think your notes point out, which rely on reversal of expectation. And irony, of course, is an example. So, who would like to read out the examples of irony for me?
I named my cute cuddly Chihuahua Tyson. The world champion tightrope walker, the magnificent Mango, broke his ankle when he slipped on a banana skin. And the fortune teller's booth was closed due to unforeseen.
And you see how funny it is. It's very simple, but it's unexpected. And if you can work irony into a speech, it's terribly rewarding. It's very simple. So always look for an opportunity to be ironic. So the exercise here comes from a book by Samuel Coleridge. Who can finish this off for me? Water, water everywhere. Exactly, it's from the Ancient Mariner. And it is, of course, one of those great tragedies about sailors. Their boat sinks, their ship sinks, they're cast to sea, they're surrounded by water, they can't drink it because it will kill them. So it's a thought-provoking one, but it obviously is a case of irony. Bathos. Bathos is the opposite of pathos. Or perhaps bathos is the opposite of pathos. I don't know. But anyway, pathos is a commonly used device. It dates back to ancient Greece. And it's when you bring your audience along, you elicit sympathy from your audience. Bathos does exactly the same thing. It starts off, you take the person on a journey, they sympathize with you, and then you spring the surprise at the end. So it's a humorous device. Pathos is not humorous on the whole, bathos is. So the examples we have here, who would like to read out the examples? First I'm beginning with Sarah. Thank you, Paul.
Sarah, once we had something that was pure and wonderful and good, something others only dream of. But what's happened to it? David, you spent it. And for a moment, nothing happened. But then after a second or so, nothing continued to happen. He spent his final hour of life doing what he loved most, arguing with his dog.
So you see how in every case you're expecting a different ending, and the humour comes when it's a complete reversal. And what's quite powerful is it sort of makes you reappraise everything that's been said to that point. So here's an example. Let's provide an example of bathos about a flight you may have been on. Let's have a minute just to think up a flight. a very rich world, aeroplanes and flying. Let's see if we can come up with an example.
I was so excited for my new proposal of joining a company in Genoa, so I booked my flight, and after 1 hour of flight, I happily landed in Geneva because I made a bomb ticket.
Yes, that would be an example. Very good. Any others?
The flight attendant said, while I'm standing, the plane is fine, as she got to the floor.
Okay, thank you. The example I came up with was, wow, that plane was old. There was a hole in the wing, a crack in the window, and the engine smoked a lot. But I got the flight attendant's telephone number. You're expecting the plane to crash, hopefully. Now, can anyone tell me when I've used bathos this evening?
When you said about like how to learn being humorous, that was quite funny.
Oh, thank you. You may well be right. I don't remember that. I did it right at the beginning of the evening. I used bathos in a fairly diluted way, I admit, in which I started talking about an entirely fictional relative of mine, if you remember. And I carried on, and all it was a device to introduce Lara, who was going to throw chocolates around. So it wasn't a history lesson, it was mumbo jumbo, really. So there's bathos, but again, very powerful tool. And there's no reason why, when giving a speech, we can't use it, especially in a humorous speech. We see how people laugh this evening. Meiosis. Meiosis is understatement that belittles or dismisses in the opposite of hyperbole. Hyperbole is when you overstate, you over-exaggerate for comic effect. Both can be amusing, but we're just going to look at meiosis here. An example of meiosis. Now, there are really two types of meiosis. You can either use meiosis to describe groups of people or professions, and it's very closely related to euphemism, or you can have an entire sentence, which is meiosis. So we could have, for example, for a personal injury lawyer, an ambulance chaser. That's meiosis. The unspeakable in full pursuit of the uneatable is what Oscar Wilde wrote about fox hunting. Monty Python used a lot of meiosis. An example here is when talking about an amputated leg, the poor fellow said, oh, it's only a flesh wound. And then there's the great example of meiosis oft quoted by Mark Twain. The reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated. So, what is a common example of meiosis used to describe environmentalists? Tree huggers, thank you. You would know that one, Susanna, wouldn't you? No. What about meiosis for a psychiatrist? A shrink, exactly. Well done. And if you wanted to build meiosis into a sentence, well, we've got some time. Let's spend a minute trying to build some meiosis into a sentence. So it's all about understating and belittling, and then having a comedic effect as a result. So let's have a minute on the clock and see if we can come up with a meiosis. Let's have it about a bus journey. What I have here is, we arrived late because the bus driver had a weak right leg. You have to think about it for a few seconds. On the continent, you'd have a weak left leg because the accelerator pedal is on the other side. Now, on to number 21. Every now and then a word comes along in the English language which is so wonderful that you just want to embrace it and hug it. You want to walk up to strangers in the street, start conversations with them just so you can use this word. Well, paraproxdazin is not an example of that at all. I think it's the most horrible sounding word ever. But it is a very powerful version of reversal of expectation. And we've got some examples here. And they're all good, I think. I mean, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. I want to die peacefully in my sleep, like my grandfather, not screaming and yelling like his passengers. And here's the one which I think is a very useful lesson in life. Always borrow money from a pessimist. You won't expect it back. And lastly, if I agreed with you, we'd both be wrong. So, complete these sentences using paraprostokian. A clear conscience is usually the sign of a close. A bad memory. I asked God for a bike, but I know God doesn't work that way, so... Correct. I stole a bike and asked for forgiveness. Sweet at the back, Laura. Kasha? And the last one we have here, paralypsis. Paralypsis involves giving emphasis by professing to say little on the subject. Now, this isn't a sort of belly laugh, this is a much more subtle laugh, but it's used quite a lot in film. People like Monty Python used to use this a lot. Example here, I won't mention that the car's handbrake doesn't work or that the engine lacks power. I don't care that the exhaust is broken and the accelerator pedal sticky, but how could you sell me that car with a scratch on the bumper? So, let's use some paralypsis about a house renovation. There are a number of drawbacks to your renovation plan, not to mention the costs. So, again, a more subtle form of humour. Now, we have a few minutes left, and I'm going to add a bonus item, which I think ties in to what we were saying in one of the questions I was asked earlier this evening. And this is about the difference between show and tell. Now, if you read a badly written book, you're very likely to hear remarks or read sentences in it like, I walked along the beautiful beach, or I strolled into the wonderful garden. Those are examples of tell. You're telling your reader what the place is like. And it's very lazy writing. And the problem with it is, if you have got your audience or your reader into the fictive dream or auditory dream and you want to keep them there, the problem with telling them is that they have to think. They have to think about it. They have to create a picture in their mind. Then they have to project themselves there. And that's a lot of effort. However, if you wrote, I walked into the garden, the sun was warming my face from the side, butterflies were fluttering over the flower beds, what you're doing is you're showing the reader or you're showing your audience what it was like. And that keeps the person in the fictive dream. When you're writing a speech and delivering your speeches, it's a very powerful device to not just tell. Tell makes the audience have to play a game of catch-up, and they have to think all the way through it. Whereas if you show them, you are bringing them into the subject matter, and then they're able to emotionally connect with it, which is, after all, what we're trying to do. So we've got a minute. Let's all just write a sentence about anything you want in which you show the rest of the room what the place was like. You don't tell me. So let's have 1 minute on the clock and give that a go. I never said it was going to be an easy evening. Yes.
Keeper was shaking.
Yes.
The ball was standing in the white spot. 100,000 souls were silent. Started running towards me.
Okay, so you're painting a picture. Anyone else like to suggest something. Let me give you an example I have here. This is tell. The marathon runner was tired. Her legs ached as she drove herself on. We get the message, but it's not very involving. If I was going to show that, I would write, the marathon runner's breathing rasped in her throat. Her legs dragged along the cobbles as she gritted her teeth. Instead of driving herself on, she's gritting her teeth, which means that she's driving herself on, and it's a much more involving way of describing something. So when you're preparing your speech, always be mindful of am I telling or am I showing? Because it's almost at a subconscious level, but an audience will react much better to being shown something than being told something. So, that brings us to the end, and just to recap on a couple of points at the beginning. When you're preparing your speech, remember to use simple language on the whole, and then use more elegant language when you want to emphasize a point, maybe at an important place in the speech, like the end of the first part or the conclusion, and use rhetorical devices to reinforce your speech. You're only going to be talking for maybe 5 to 7 minutes on the whole. You don't need to flood your speech with these. The idea is take these home, work your way through them, and pick 2 or maybe 3, and just use them at those points in your speech where they'll be most effective. Remember, of course, to tailor your speech to your audience. If you're talking to a room full of school children, your language is going to be more simple than if you're delivering a paper to a bunch of nuclear scientists. But on the whole, if Barack Obama uses a very simple speech, there's no reason why we shouldn't, and he relies on the rhetorical devices to lift his speech. So keep things simple. 2 or 3 devices in a speech is adequate. And finally, go away, experiment, and have fun. And I think you'll see how enjoyable this is when you start using these techniques in your speech making. Thank you.